Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Oh, there you are. I knew I'd do something to wake you up. I just had breakfast 30 seconds ago, a Cadbury cream egg. That was breakfast. And at least it was an egg, maybe had some protein, I don't know. All right, we are possibly going to transition into Esther today. If we get to that point, I think we will. We won't be able to delve too far. And I'll remind you again why we're going to do that. And it's because chronologically, Esther fits in between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. And Ezra doesn't let us know that. We just have to figure that out from other sources. But just to review sort of where we've been most recently, after 70 years of captivity, the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians under their king Cyrus. And as had been prophesied by Isaiah, as had been indicated by Jeremiah, that this wasn't going to be two and done, 2 years and then we're back home as far as the captivity. It's going to be 70 years. But Cyrus comes along, and because of the Lord, he tells many of the exiles who have been away from their homeland, away from their destroyed holy city, away from their destroyed temple, whoever wants to go back can go back. And over 40,000 do. There are far more that don't go back, but there's over 40,000 who do return. And that would have been the next year, 538 BC. They get settled in for a couple of years, getting their own arrangements made, and then probably 536 BC, they lay the foundation of the temple. And then, as always happens, when good things begin to unfold, opposition arises. And because of that opposition, if you'll look at Ezra chapter 4, if you've got your print or electronic Bibles available. Ezra chapter 4, after they initially say the peoples of the land who had been resettled there during the Assyrian captivity, and then during the Babylonian captivity, those people where the 10 tribes had been, they just moved farther south where Judah and Benjamin had been. They worshiped Yahweh, but they worshiped all their other gods as well, and they said, hey, we'll join with you in this project. And Zerubbabel and the others say, no, this is our work. But still, verse 4, then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. If you're a fan of Hootie and the Blowfish, you may want to call him Darius. If you want to call him Darius, that's fine. I'll call him Darius. But what happens next in the text is a time warp forward to the reign of Artaxerxes. And that's verse 7, in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia. So we're not going to deal with that text at this point because it's anachronistic in the sense that it's just going to be confusing if we talk about that now. The question arises, why would Ezra put that here and then backtrack immediately? Probably because he's dealing with things thematically. He's dealing thematically with the idea of opposition and pushback. And so he just tells us about some more that will follow later. So as I suggested at the end of class last week, you can draw a line, and you can do that in your printed Bible if you want to. From the end of verse 5 of chapter 4, you can draw a line to the beginning of verse 24 and not miss a beat chronologically, because everything in between there is yet future. So verse 24 says, thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So this slide lets us know that for about 15 years then, from approximately 535 to 520 BC, nothing's happening on the temple. And God's going to have to shake things up. And he's going to shake things up through Haggai. He's going to shake things up through Zechariah. So reading on into chapter 5, then Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. And I'll just review with you again just because I think it's so incredibly important. Some of the things that Haggai and Zechariah said, these are the next to the last and the next to the next to the last books in our Old Testament. Two of the three post-exilic prophets. And Haggai says in verse 3 of Haggai 1, then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Have you wondered why things haven't gone well? Have you wondered why you've planted much but harvested little? You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. You put on clothes but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. So enough time working on your own houses. Let's work on the house of the Lord. Verse 13, Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. And one thing I mentioned last week, after he says, I'm going to shake things up, verse 9 of chapter 2, the glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty, and this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. And you remember how some of the people wept when they saw the foundation of the temple when it had been laid. They were nostalgic. They were thinking about Solomon's temple. And when they're trying to get this work restarted, Haggai assures them the glory of this house is going to be greater than Solomon's temple. And that's because of who was going to be in that house. That's the temple where Jesus is going to be presented. That's where Jesus is going to teach. That's where Jesus is going to heal. And then as far as Zechariah is concerned, there's so much, he's echoing Haggai's prophecy, but he includes a lot of visions, and there is so much messianic prophecy in Zechariah related to this temple that they're encouraging the people to rebuild. We're not going to take the time to read all this again, but verses 9 through 15 of chapter 6, this is where Zechariah foresees a priest and a king in one person. Priests come from the tribe of Levi and the family of Aaron. Kings came from the tribe of Judah and the family of David. How can you have a king and a priest in one person? God's going to do it through Jesus Christ. And it's amazing that the high priest serving at the time has the same name that Mary and Joseph are going to give their child, or Mary's child by the Holy Spirit when he is born. The name Jesus, from the Greek Iesus, is the equivalent of Yeshua or Yehoshua in Hebrew, Joshua. So during the time of a high priest named Joshua, this prophecy is made about another priest who will come, who will be a king. He's going to have the same name, a name that means salvation is of the Lord, a name that means God saves. In chapter 9, verse 9, that's the prophecy. Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And we know when that is fulfilled. One that I didn't mention last week from chapter 11, verse 13, the Lord said to me, verses 12 and 13, I said to them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter at the house of the Lord. And you remember Judas returning the 30 pieces of silver. and the messed up morals of the Jews. They could pay blood money, but they wouldn't take it back into the temple treasury. And so they bought the potter's field as a burial place. And then chapter 12, middle of verse 10, they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn child. John chapter 19 says this was fulfilled when the soldier standing by the cross of Jesus thrusts his spear into his side, and blood and water come forth. And then finally, chapter 13 of Zechariah, middle of verse 7, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. Matthew 26 and Mark 14 say that that's what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is arrested and the disciples scatter. They run. And he quotes, that Matthew and Mark quote this prophecy of Zechariah. The shepherd that we'll talk about in the worship hour this morning, the shepherd has been struck, the shepherd has been smitten, and the sheep are scattering. So, because Zechariah and Haggai are preaching this kind of message, the work on the temple gets started again. Chapter 5 of Ezra, verse 2, then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, the son of Josadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. And that's in 520 BC, ish. You may find a 521 date, 519. We'll call it 520. And it's just a powerful combination of leadership here. You've got these bold prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, who are saying 15 years is long enough to be sitting on your hands. Let's get back to work. And you've got civil leadership, political leadership under Zerubbabel, and religious leadership under Joshua, the high priest. And once again, opposition comes. And you know that common piece of wisdom, be careful what you ask for. Be careful what you bring up. Tattenai, who is the governor of the entire Trans-Euphrates area, and again, Trans-Euphrates can be either to the east or the west of the Euphrates, depending on which side you're on. For the Persians, the Trans-Euphrates was to the west of the Euphrates. For Israel, Trans-Euphrates was the other direction. But he's the one who gets concerned about this work. This foundation hasn't been bothering anybody. But now all this work is starting. And he writes a letter to Darius. Verse 6. This is a copy of the letter that Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates, the officials of Trans-Euphrates, sent to King Darius. The report to him read as follows. To King Darius, cordial greetings. The king should know that we went to the district of Judah. Notice that Judah is just a small district in the province of the Trans-Euphrates. The king should know that we went to the district of Judah, to the temple of the great God. The people are building it with large stones, placing the timbers in the walls. The work is being carried on with diligence and is making rapid progress under their direction. We questioned the elders and asked them, who authorized you to build this temple and to finish it? We asked them their names so that we could write down the names of their leaders for your information. They are literally taking names so that those responsible can be held accountable if there's a problem. We are the servants of the God. This is the answer they gave us. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, one that a great king of Israel built and finished. Doesn't mention his name Solomon, but we know who that was. And because our ancestors angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldean, king of Babylon, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon in 605, in 598, in 586 BC, 3 waves of Babylonian captivity. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild this house of God. Remember, Darius is now the king. He even removed from the temple of Babylon the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to the temple in Babylon. Then King Cyrus gave them to a man named Sheshbazzar, whom he appointed governor, and he told him, take these articles and go and deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem and rebuild the house of God on its site. So this Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem. And here's some misinformation. And they're not intentionally misrepresenting this. They just assume it's been the case. From that day to the present, it has been under construction, but is not yet finished. He doesn't mention that nothing really happened for 15 years. He just says the foundation was laid, work is going on, and this is troublesome. Now, if it pleases the king, let a search be made of the royal archives of Babylon to see if King Cyrus did in fact issue a decree to rebuild this house of God in Jerusalem. Then let the king send us his decision in this matter. And Tattenai undoubtedly believes that he's doing Darius a favor. Temples attract a lot of attention and a lot of fervor, which can become nationalistic fervor, and we don't want a rebellion on our hands. And so they claim they have a Persian edict to rebuild this temple. I don't know anything about that, so could you check the records? So the king does. He issued an order, chapter 6, verse 1. They searched in the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon. There were 4 capitals that the Persians had. One was the capital city of Babylon, which had been the center of the empire of Babylon. They take the city, if you remember at the end of the book of Daniel, or really in the middle of the book of Daniel, the end of the historical section of Daniel, Babylon is taken without a battle. You know, the city is not destroyed. So let's use that as one of our capitals. We'll use Susa, the ancient capital of Elam, as one of our capitals. Persepolis and Ecbatana. They had 4 capitals. But since Cyrus would have issued this decree from the city of Babylon, the search was going to take place there. And a scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written on it. Memorandum. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the people of God in Jerusalem. Let the people rebuild as a place to present sacrifices. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices. Let its foundations be laid. It is to be 60 cubits high, 60 cubits wide. And this is just, 90 feet by 90 feet. And with 3 courses of large stones and 1 of timbers, the costs are to be paid by the royal treasury, Tattenai, the treasury that you're in charge of. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are to be returned to their places in the temple in Jerusalem. They are to be deposited in the house of God. So, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, and you other officials of that province, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews, Zerubbabel, and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. And regardless of how Tattenai had wanted that to be resolved, I don't know if he was hoping maybe they can't find this. I'm thinking the Jews just made this up. I don't think there was really a decree from Cyrus. This would have been fine for him, I'm sure, just to accept this instruction from Darius. Leave them alone. don't interfere. Just don't do anything. But that's not where the instructions stop, much to Tattenai's dismay, I'm sure. Verse 8, moreover, I hereby decree that you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God, their expenses are to be paid out of the royal treasury from the revenues of the Trans-Euphrates, your budget, so that the work will not stop. Whatever is needed, not just for the construction, but for sacrifice, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. Which king and his sons? Darius and his sons. I want you to help them build this temple. I want you to provide animals for sacrifice. And when they're sacrificing, among their prayers, they're going to be praying for me. And they're going to be praying for my sons. One of those sons' name is Xerxes, which we'll get to in the story of Esther. Furthermore, if you wonder how seriously this was to be taken, furthermore, Tattenai, verse 11, I decree that if anyone defies this edict, a beam is to be pulled from their house, and they're to be impaled on it. And for this crime, their house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or to destroy this temple in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. Thanks for asking. Thanks for checking. And I'm holding you personally responsible to make sure this temple gets built and that it's fully paid for out of your budget over there in the Trans-Euphrates. So because of the decree, verse 13, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. Artaxerxes is still yet future. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. And you may have a note in your Bible that says 516. 515 is a date I've just worked with for a long time, and so I just still use that as a marker date for the completion of the temple. We won't break fellowship if you say it was 516. We'll be able to get along wonderfully if it's 516 or 515. But that's when, once again, let's see, it was 586. So 586 to 516 is exactly 70 years. That's one of the ways to calculate the 70 years of captivity is from the destruction of the temple to the completion of the temple. And we can offer sacrifice again, and the feasts can be celebrated here again. The feasts were established by the law before there was a temple. But once the temple was built, some of those feasts became pilgrimage feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. And so they're going to, centered around the temple once again for the first time in 70 years, celebrate the Passover. Verse 16, then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. For the dedication of this house of God, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And they installed the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. These clans and families within the tribe of Levi have continued to exist. They just haven't had a job to do. And now once again with the temple rebuilt, they can get about the work for their various divisions as specified by the law and later by Solomon when the temple was built. Verse 19, on the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. And I'm sure in captivity, the Passover continued to be celebrated, but there was no pilgrimage possible back to Jerusalem. At that point, it was in ruins. The temple was in ruins. And as they are captive in a faraway place, as they celebrated the Passover during those years of captivity, I'm sure they thought about its original context. Celebrated in Egypt before God called them out, brought them to the land of promise. And every year, maybe their market, for those who had really taken Jeremiah's prophecy to heart, maybe they were marking off those years on the calendar. You know, it's been 10 years, it's been 20 years, it's been 30 years. I'm not going to live to see it. And the next generation, it's been 40 years, it's been 50 years, it's been 60 years. Just this anticipation of being able to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem at the temple once again. The priests and the Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles. These are the returned exiles, for their relatives, the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. And then after the Passover day comes the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in their work on the house of God, the God of Israel. The king of Assyria, well, that's Darius, king of Persia, who now rules over Babylon, Assyria, everybody else who had gotten in his way. So, an incredible accomplishment has taken place. And if we just went from the end of verse 22 in chapter 6 to the beginning of verse 1 in chapter 7, after these things, that's a true statement. After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, the son of Sariah, and then it gives his family tree, on down to, at the end of verse 5, goes all the way back to Phinehas, Eleazar, and Aaron, Moses' brother. That's his priestly lineage. This Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a teacher well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord of God of Israel had given. And if we didn't know any better, we would just think when it says, after these things, a few weeks, a few months, a couple of years later, Ezra, the scribe and the priest, goes back with some exiles, another group of exiles. It's been almost 60 years that have intervened between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. So just to remind you here about the chronology, between Cyrus and Darius, there was actually Cambyses, which isn't mentioned in the Bible, but that's why that gap exists between the end of Cyrus's reign and the beginning of Darius's reign. And so we're going to, when we get to chapter 7, we've leapfrogged all the way down here to the reign of Artaxerxes. And it's about 458 or 459 right in here, when the events of chapter 7 begin to be described. So that's why we're going to back up and go to the book of Esther and talk about things that happened during the reign of Xerxes. You may have a translation in Esther, so just go ahead and turn to blow on through the rest of Ezra and all the way through Nehemiah till you get to Esther. In your English translation of the book of Esther, you may have the name of the king as being Ahasuerus, and that was the Jews. That's the name that appears in the Hebrew Bible, Ahasuerus, and that was the Jews' best attempt at spelling and trying to say the Persian name of this king. Transliterated into English letters, it's crazy. I don't know how you would pronounce that name. I've got no idea how to pronounce that name. The Greeks called him Xerxes. Thank you, Greeks. So we're going to call him Xerxes. And, just understand if your Bible has Ahasuerus, that's the name that the Jews used to try to mirror his Persian name, and we'll just call him Xerxes. So just understand we're talking about the same reign here. He isn't mentioned at all in Ezra or Nehemiah. His story, and the story of Esther, takes place in that nearly 60-year gap between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. So this is what happened, chapter 1, verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. So just imagine your world map, and from India westward to Africa, and traveling from the Nile Delta south up the Nile to Sudan. And all of that area in between is ruled by the Persians at this point. Alexander's going to come along over 100 years later and take that entire territory for himself. But that huge area is divided up into 127 provinces. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. We saw Babylon and Ecbatana mentioned in Ezra. This is a third of those 4 capital cities, Persepolis being the other one. And in the 3rd year of his reign, which would be 483 or 484, depending on whether you use the accession year or not. In the 3rd year of his reign, so it's 484, 483, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. Well, there is going to be this 7-day feast, but it's at the end of a 6-month World's Fair, a 6-month exposition. And that's what verse 4 begins to describe. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. And it's like the British Museum and the Louvre and the Smithsonian were all put together, and people came from everywhere to see these exhibitions of the wealth of Persia. When those days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace. And this was a part of typical Persian architecture, having these gardens. And the word that they used in Persian to describe these gardens, the Greeks used the word paradisos. to describe it. The word from which we get paradise. And so when that word appears in Scripture, when Jesus says to the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise," when paradise is used as a description of the first garden, the Garden of Eden, as far as linguistics and word etymology are concerned, that word comes from a Persian word that the Greeks translated as paradisos, that we translate as paradise. So the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. And the royal wine was abundant. In keeping with the king's liberality, by the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions. For the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. And you can sort of get a sense of the environment of this banquet. There are no limits on the serving of alcohol. And it goes from 1 day to 2 days to 3 days to 4 days to 5 days to 6 days to a full week of 7 days. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. And while Esther is going to be the heroine and the primary character in this story, don't think of Vashti as being some kind of anti-hero. From what we read about her, she was an incredible woman. A woman with a moral core in a culture and in an environment that didn't have much of one. So on the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, and I'm not even going to bother saying their names because they don't reappear again, and they're hard to say. So I'm going to skip over them. The 7 eunuchs who served him were commanded to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown. And in a lot of Jewish rabbinic writings and traditional writings about the story of Esther, their interpretation of this was that she was ordered to come in only wearing her crown. Not just, in addition to your robes and everything you're wearing, make sure you wear your crown. The Jews' interpretation of this later, at least, was she was called to appear wearing nothing but her crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. She possesses dignity and grace and decorum and discernment. She possesses modesty, and whether just refusing to be paraded, period, before all these drunken officials, or refusing to come in nude before these officials, she doesn't. She refuses. And you understand autocratic rule, especially in those days. The king's word was the king's command was law, and a breach of that was extremely, extremely serious. So he burns with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke to the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. Memucan is the only one we'll mention there, the last of them, because he will appear a little later. The 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. These are the equivalent of cabinet secretaries. These are the equivalent of political advisors, because there's no real precedent on this. There's no law necessarily on the books that says if you send for the queen and she doesn't come, this is what happens. So he needs to consult with his advisors. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She's not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. And so based on precedent, based on other legal stipulations, what should be done? Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of Xerxes, all 127 of them. This is a national disgrace, and she's embarrassed you in front of everybody within your kingdom. So you can't just let this go. The queen's conduct will become known to, okay, here's the rub. The queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands, including this husband. I'm assuming all these guys are married, and when they find out what the queen has done, their wives might start getting some ideas. They will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she wouldn't come. You think I'm going to do what you asked me to do? This very day, the Persian and Median women of nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. This is a train wreck, Xerxes, and something needs to be done about it. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree. Let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed. And if you'll remember, this comes up in the book of Daniel in regard to his prayer life. They can't find anything to accuse him of, so they convince another Darius. And don't get the two confused. This king of Persia is not Darius the Mede, who is controlling Babylon after Cyrus defeats Babylon. But once something is put into law, it can't be repealed. That Vashti never again be able to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. If you want women to respect their husbands, just make a law. And that will make them respect their husbands. That's the way it works, right? The king and his nobles were pleased with his advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent this passage to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in his own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household using his native tongue. This thing is not going to become a wildfire on my watch. And then there's going to be a little gap of time, and just I think about 3 or 4 years, and then we'll pick up in chapter 2 next week. What happens in that interim is a humiliating defeat of Xerxes at the hand of the Greeks. And so when he gets back, he's going to set about once again trying to find a queen to replace Vashti. All right, thanks very much for your presence and your kind attention this morning, and we'll begin our worship assembly in about 15 minutes.